I'd like to join the gentlewoman from the 33rd District in thanking both herself and everyone else she mentioned, the gentleman from the 3rd, the good and gracious chair of the Appropriations Committee, the gentleman from the 11th, and the gentleman from the 43rd, who along with the gentlewoman from the 43rd, who along with the gentlewoman from the 33rd, all serve as vice chairs of the Appropriations Committee. And would also like to thank the partisan and nonpartisan staff who helped put this 1,400-page budget together. I have been exposed to a very tiny sliver of all of the work they do. I am in some, but not nearly all of the meetings they are. It takes a tremendous amount of work to put together a $70 billion budget that funds the state's needs and priorities. And as much as we disagree on what exactly the scope of those needs are and how we order those priorities, the fact of the matter is it is a substantively daunting task they undertook. They got far less sleep than you did, Madam Speaker, far less sleep than I did, and the entire state owes them a debt of gratitude for their dedication to the job. I also want to thank that team led by the gentleman from the 3rd District for his willingness to hear out suggestions and requests for provisos and other funding items in the budget. He had a pretty open door to both me and my colleagues in this caucus. He had a process whereby we could request and argue for things that were important for our districts, and I really do appreciate that. But in spite of that, Madam Speaker, I'm urging a no vote tonight. And it's not because we were unable to present our ideas, but to give you a sense of the scale of how big the budget is and where Republican ideas play into that. There are around 1,500 individual policy-level additions in this budget. About 50 of them came at the suggestion or request of House Republicans. And don't get me wrong, I'm very grateful that those 50 items are scattered throughout this budget. A few of them were requested by me, a few of them were requested by, or the others were requested by my colleagues here on this side of the aisle, and none of us would have sought that funding or sought that proviso language if we did not think it was something that was critically important for the communities we represent and the state that we serve. And so I'm glad that those provisos and those suggestions were included in this budget. But, Madam Speaker, 50 out of 1,500 is about 3%. We represent about 40% of Washington residents. We represent about 3 million people on this side of the aisle. And to say that we only get to suggest 50 out of the 1,500 policy-level additions in the budget, I think is insufficient. I don't think that is the kind of inclusion that we would like to see over here on this side of the aisle. You heard a number of amendments tonight, Madam Speaker, and many of which were not adopted. And in remarks explaining why they should not be adopted, members on the other side of the aisle noted that the amendments would have us pit one program against the other. But, Madam Speaker, that is an unfortunate necessity of the fact that Republicans were not included in the room where these decisions were made. Because of our really strong balanced budget requirement in Washington state, Republicans can't simply suggest that we should spend more on something without sending our budget out of balance. So instead, we need to suggest if we want to increase funding in an area, we need to identify where funding should be decreased. And that's not easy, and it certainly doesn't make you popular. Trust me, Madam Speaker, it is not nearly as much fun to be the caucus that says we are spending too much money. However, Madam Speaker, had Republicans been allowed in the room, so to speak, I think that a lot of these discussions could have happened in a more productive manner. And rather than pitting one program against the other, we could have had robust debates like I had with the gentlewoman from the 48th about the degree to which we are funding Evergreen State College versus the degree to which we want to fund low-income high school kids taking dual credit courses. And there could have been some give and take, and we could have found a happy medium. But unfortunately, Madam Speaker, when Republicans aren't included in the process, we have no choice but to point out in stark contrast where our priorities are, and you saw that tonight. But I think there could have been a better way where we could have had much more of a dialogue and much more of a give and take. And Madam Speaker, I noted a second ago on my brief remarks on the striking amendment to the bill that is now before us that I recommended a no vote because I felt like the underlying bill that has now been amended by the striking amendment was better. Madam Speaker, when this bill that's before us came over from the body across the rotunda, it came on a very strong bipartisan vote. It came on a 40-9 vote. Over half of the minority caucus in the body across the rotunda voted for this bill when it was before them. Madam Speaker, they were allowed in the room. They had substantive role in negotiating what was included and what was not included in that budget. And it led to over half of that minority caucus voting for this budget. But unfortunately, Madam Speaker, because my caucus was not involved, I'm recommending a no vote on this budget. Madam Speaker, we have a lot of concerns about the substance in the budget that I think could have been addressed had there been a more inclusive process. As I mentioned a minute ago, I got elected in 2014. At that point in time, the state budget spent about $33.7 billion. The budget that is now before us on the floor will spend $69.6 billion. That represents a doubling of state spending in about 8 or 9 years. Here, I don't think my family's household income has doubled in 8 or 9 years. I certainly don't think many of the constituents I represent have seen their own budgets double in the last 8 or 9 years. I don't know very many small businesses who have seen their revenue double in the last 8 or 9 years, but state spending will have now doubled with the passage of this budget. Also, Madam Speaker, a minute ago I mentioned the state treasurer, and I really appreciate the job he's doing. It's a hard job, and our state's bond ratings are very good, thanks to leadership in that office from Republicans previously and Democrats currently. Madam Speaker, we received a letter from the state treasurer a few days ago suggesting that the budget ensure that we leave 10% of the general fund as reserves. But the budget that is now before us misses that mark. Before it was amended, it did meet that mark, but as it has now been amended, our reserves are at 6.8%, far short of the 10% the treasurer recommends. And lastly, Madam Speaker, in terms of its sustainability, by funding so many different items, 1,500 items by my count, it left less money able to be devoted towards the state's most urgent and pressing priorities. And that is another reason why I'm recommending a no vote, Madam Speaker. The state has been blessed by a number of very successful companies and individuals, and our tax revenues have grown very quickly, and that is why we've been able to pass budgets that will now be doubling in a period of 8 or 9 years. But despite all of this new revenue, Madam Speaker, I think this budget fails to address the state's most urgent and pressing priorities. You heard a little bit about those priorities tonight. First and foremost, funding education is the state's paramount duty. We on this side of the aisle believe that that is what we should fund first before we address anything else. That's not to say those other things aren't important. There are, of course, many other important things that are funded in the state budget, but none of them are the state's paramount duty under its Constitution to fund. K-12 education is. And so we had amendments to increase funding for special education, to address the severe amount of learning loss that our kids suffered when their schools were closed or conducted remotely during the pandemic. And it would have ensured that high school kids in dual credit classes that were low income had those course fees covered. So, Madam Speaker, by spending money in so many other areas, we have neglected to meet our constitutional duty to fully fund education. That should have been funded first, not alongside and as part of everything else included in this budget. Madam Speaker, we also believe on this side of the aisle that we need safe communities, and a number of our amendments would have helped us achieve that goal. We had a chance to provide funding to help clean up encampments. And as the gentleman from the 35th District mentioned, our own governor just said just this last week that these encampments are a scourge on our state and they need to be cleaned up. We had funding available for cities to do that, and unfortunately, that amendment was rejected. We also face a tremendous shortage of qualified police officers, and so an amendment from the gentlewoman from the 25th District to provide recruitment and retention bonuses for law enforcement officers to refill their depleted ranks. And lastly, Madam Speaker, we want to make Washington a more affordable place to live and work and grow a family. And most disappointingly in that regard, Madam Speaker, we had a chance to increase funding for the Working Families Tax Credit to provide some of that relief to make Washington more affordable. Unfortunately, that is not included in this budget. So, Madam Speaker, I'm recommending a no vote. I think a better result could have happened had there been a more inclusive process, and I hope with about 20 or something days left in session that can happen. But in the meantime, please vote no.